lines of thought that I think could be really interesting to pursue further. We ended last time on the point of, we kind of looked at what are the ways the adaptive unconscious works with pattern recognition, selecting for attention, all of those things. And it kind of ended with that one of the main methods the adaptive unconscious uses is accessibility. To determine what's going on, it often recognizes the patterns that are accessible to it. Accessible meaning the ones that are available to it. Difference between professional chess player and somebody who's just learning chess, of what can they actually recognize, but also to some degree what is chronically accessible. So that would be more if we look at something like negative childhood experiences, and that those can be chronically accessible. So I perceive every situation as dangerous, even if it's not. Because the adaptive unconscious has a chronically accessible, basically danger detector that takes certain things to be dangerous, even if they're realistically not. And I think that's actually looking at this question of accessibility and what does that mean for learning? What does that mean for everyday life? What are the things that are accessible to you? What are the things that are accessible to me? And how do we thus perceive and interact with, for instance, a learning situation or a new theory or whatever differently? I think that can be actually a really interesting question. And I think it goes deeply into questions like heuristics. We may use the same heuristics, but you have different data that's available for your heuristics. Priming. How do we, through priming, make something accessible so that people then act based on that priming? Stereotypes. How are stereotypes accessible, and thus we use them to kind of navigate the world. So I think that could be just a really ground understanding of what does this accessibility really mean. So maybe that could be already kind of a starting point, because then I have a few thoughts that I think could be interesting, which further going further in the book, he has two distinctions that I think could also be really interesting also for further understanding learning, which is what he calls the doing before knowing principle, which is that especially in child development, you can see that children learn specific principles of behavior. One of them would be the discounting principle. I practice piano, and if I am rewarded afterwards, I will assume, oh, I must have not really liked playing the piano. So it's one of those intrinsic, extrinsic motivation things. And research has often thought, oh, children learn this discounting principles around the age of 3 or 4, because they can then say, oh, I got rewarded, so I must not have liked it very much. But actually, further research shows that they've been acting according to that principle for a very long time before they were able to verbalize it. So this, for learning, how often do we actually learn something on an unconscious level before we even come close to being able to verbalize it? I think that can be a really interesting second question. And a third question, I'm just going to throw these 3 questions that I'm currently exploring out there, is one of the main ways he assumes we can change our unconscious is through changing the information it is making decisions upon. So basically, what's the information? In your words, it would probably, what's the long-term memory content that our adaptive unconscious, our unconscious has accessible and can make decisions based upon. And the question I would then have is, how do we actually do that? How do we actually change the information that's available to our unconscious so that it can, for instance, evaluate situations differently? How does that really work? How can we, through our consciousness, kind of say, okay, I would like more of this in my adaptive unconscious. How do I put it in there? What are the ways to do that?
So let's start from the first one then. With accessibility, when you first started using that word, I found it surprising, because one reason is that access as a concept has an idea of somebody who is accessing, or some agent doing the accessing. So the one thing is that wouldn't be entirely, I mean, to be fair, words like access are here used really as a metaphor. So I shouldn't be too pedantic about it. But you know, if it is a metaphor, then some aspects of it, some aspects particular to the idea of access should be good, like should be good for explaining or describing the situation. So one might be that someone is doing the accessing. I'm not like, to me, that seems a bit awkward. I can't immediately think of what that would be. But the second thing about access is actually, it occurred to me when you spoke a bit longer, how I could think of access, is that because if you compare something like priming to well-maintained or strong schemas, so if you have a strong schema, then even when unprimed, it will be easy to engage that in your thinking, let's say. But if you're primed, then you might have a schema you don't use as often, or that it's not as strong, that will actually be working more effectively and be easier to use in your thinking because you've been primed. So in that sense, you can talk about two, or from what I see here, you can talk about two factors that contribute to making something accessible, which is recent illumination or recent activation. Recent meaning within the last, certainly less than a day. I mean, I'm thinking minutes, but I imagine less than a day would probably also be a sensible length of time. And also just the sort of strength, or how ingrained and how well developed a particular schema is, or set of schemas is. Yeah, so it's like how powerful that thing is, and then like multiplied by how warmed up it is, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. So that's how I would view. That's how I would try and understand activation based on, access based on, or accessibility based on what you were saying there in that.
That in his words, those two would be recency, and the other one would be kind of chronic accessibility, which doesn't have to be bad. Like, it can be that you have really useful schemas that are available to you, but it can also be that,
or not, yeah.
Exactly, it can also be that you have really non-useful schemas that are chronically available to you.
Yeah. So what one is, I mean, you could say one of those is the result, often anyway, of deliberate attempts to build. If, for example, we're talking about expertise, and one of them is usually the result of continued behavior that results in stuff you don't want, I suppose. I mean, I was going to use the word maladaptive, but usually, as you were saying before, these things are adaptive to some particular situation. They're just not universally very well adapted. So, like, they're adapted, for example, they might be making you safe as a child or something like that, and then as a result, because they're there, then they end up getting used a lot, and they end up getting ingrained for the longer term, and they're not appropriate in other situations.
It's even, I think it can even be simpler. If I think about something like, let's imagine it's about body movement. As children, we experiment with our body movement when we learn how to walk. It's like, how the fuck does walking work? And then usually when we've reached a certain competency at walking, we're like, okie dokie, I can walk now. But then, for instance, if you want to go further in athletic pursuits, you want to get really good at basketball, you have to probably change some of your inherent movement patterns to become more efficient at certain things. So you kind of have to relearn those things that once were good enough, but to get to a certain level, they may not be anymore. And you have to change that basic pattern and that basic perceptive pattern potentially.
That's in fact what happens with dance. So indirectly in sports, you may have to change some aspect of the way you move in order to increase your efficiency for the sake of other actions taken that you do in the sport. But in dance, the entire purpose is to change the way that you move to some specific style or way of moving. So then you actually have to pay attention to little features of your movement that you normally don't pay attention to and change them. Yeah.
Which this reminds me, I know that you've done the Coach Wooden podcasts. I haven't listened to them yet, but I know that he was one of the main ways he taught was actually something that reminded me of what you said. He was very focused on fundamentals, and he would always give people one really small fundamental thing they should pay attention to, and they should change. So where they place their foot, how they hold the ball, and he would drill that thing, knowing or hoping that that would change the bigger pattern. But really being clear on this: do this, don't do it like that, but do it like this.
In fact, exactly what you just said. Do this, don't do it like that, do this. That's called a sandwich, which was a method that he used a lot, actually. A wooden sandwich. Do this, don't do this, do this. Yeah. And then, so the second question that you mentioned today, I can't actually remember what it was. Can you remind me, please?
The second one was, let me think. We had accessibility. Oh, we had this doing before knowing principle.
Yeah, okay. So this is something that I hadn't heard of this principle before, and I didn't know that about children, but I do know that it's certainly very much the case that people are only verbally aware of a small fraction of what they're doing, and they're only able to explain a small fraction of what they're doing. For example, there's research around people around taking experts. So for example, in medical teaching, there's a way of teaching surgeons, which is that you have a surgeon perform an operation, or it could be a dummy operation, but you have a surgeon perform an operation with students watching, and then they explain what they're doing as they're doing it. And then afterwards, I can't actually remember what happened next, but the crux of it is that's how it works. Is that there's a demonstration along with explanation given by the person who's doing the demonstration, and then this is what the students learn from. I think afterwards they have to sort of explain the procedure and then do the procedure, something like that. But the crux of it is that there's a person who's doing it and explaining it. And then when some researchers came and looked at this in more detail, they discovered that there were the amount of stuff that was being explained was about 30% of the total of the skills, the things that were being employed by the specialist. So what ended up being a more effective way of teaching was actually to analyze a surgeon as an outsider or something of an outsider, look at all of their behaviors, including the ones they didn't speak about, they may not have been aware of, and then provide that information to novices, students, and have them learn from that. And in that case, I don't remember how they measured this, but they discovered that it was much better for teaching when it was that way. So there's lots of stuff that a person wouldn't explain. It might be because it's too obvious to them and they think it's obvious, but it might also be because they're simply unaware that they're doing that. And it's been found that people doing all sorts of tasks, even tasks which seem to be very apparently explicit and logical. So an example of that would be computer programming. When doing debugging, then there are lots of, I think that's one thing that's been studied, debugging. And there are lots of things that an experienced programmer will do that they won't say that they're doing when they're doing it to solve a problem. Part of their problem solving kit, but it's not something that they can say that they're using. So this kind of thing, I mean, there's another thing, which is the whole thing about stuff like the inner game of tennis and stuff like that, where you deliberately try and verbally get out of the way of your body and have your body do it and respond to it itself without you verbalizing too much about what you're doing. And by verbalizing, you actually get in your own way. I mean, this is probably because you have separated parts in your brain which are involved in each of these, the motor versus the verbal parts that not well integrated. Probably why, I guess. So this sort of thing is, I mean, I also think that basically the whole of anthropology is predicated on the idea that there's all this stuff that people do that they can't explain, and then anthropologists come in and explain it. Because they don't so much have a central theory or a central concern about human behavior, like for example, I mean, a psychologist, I suppose, is still could be very general, but they could look at things from different sides and take a particular angle on why people have this approach. And then you have you can even talk about economists talking about people trying to maximize their own benefit or something like that. But then with an anthropologist, I suppose anthropologists aren't talking about individuals, talking about cultures. But nevertheless, it really seems like what they're doing is they're going into a place and saying, well, all these people are following all these rules and this way of being in this culture, but none of them can really explain what they're doing. So I'm going to go there and I'm going to say it. I'm going to make it explicit.
Which would again point to this distinction between explicit and implicit learning. That we learn a lot of information implicitly. We kind of take it on, you call it osmosis, call it whatever you want to call it. And that so much of what we do and how we behave is actually not reflected or not, oh, I see these people do that, so I think it's a really good idea to do that as well. It's just what happens. And that I think this being clear on how much of what we do is actually implicitly learned and how much of what we then explicitly think about is again based on layers and layers of already implicit learning is actually a really interesting thing to think about. So when you talk, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I mean, one thing is that it does seem that this is more common among children than among adults. The children seem to be doing a lot of implicit learning, as you might call it, and less explicit than adults. Adults seem to be the other way around for children. Well, I don't mean the other way around, like there's necessarily more explicit learning than implicit learning. I just mean adults learn more explicitly than children do, and children learn more implicitly than adults do. So, like a typical example of that would be language. There's a critical age at about something like 12-ish, something between like 11 and 13, where after that age, most people starting to learn a new language will not be able to learn it to a native speaker level. Well, actually, people probably can, but it just takes. People don't usually have a native accent at that level unless they spend a very long time training it. Whereas before the age of 11, if you achieve basically proficiency in some language environment by the age of 11, you're likely to naturally, without training, adopt whatever accent is used in your surroundings. So you'll sound like a native speaker, and probably quite possibly, could be called a native speaker. So this, I mean, the whole idea of the way that accents come about is the reason why they're so easy for children, I guess, is because of this kind of implicit learning that's going on. I mean, language learning might be slightly different from other kinds of learning, but there is this implicit thing going on. There's some research about saying that it's actually different kinds of feedback that children below that age respond to. That there's a kind of apparently a positive feedback for children below the age of around 11-ish, and they respond more to negative feedback above the age of about 11. I haven't actually looked into that research in too much detail, but apparently there are different sort of feedback mechanisms in children and adults, or children and adolescents, and that's partly responsible for this kind of difference at different ages. I mean, it certainly seems that you're as an adult, you're going to carry on at any stage in your life. You've got your history, and it's going to affect you, and so at any stage beyond childhood, you've got your whole childhood that has affected you and continues to affect you over time. And then it seems, sorry.
Finish your point.
Yeah, so it seems to me that while implicit learning probably does continue to happen over time, I imagine the bulk of it is happening in childhood.
And I would really like to explore that kind of idea, because I'm not sure that's the case. Like this, what you said, children probably learn more implicitly. I would say yes, because children don't yet really have the capacities to learn explicitly a lot. So I think adults definitely learn explicitly more than children. We can teach ourselves something in a different way than a child can, and we can think about things differently than a child can. I would agree with that, but the guess I would have is that actually still by a long margin of what our learning is implicitly, and that also the explicit learning has to be based on a lot of implicit learning, which would then, for me, bring about questions of how do we create learning contexts in which this kind of trying to understand something explicitly, but having the space to experiment and do the implicit learning can actually happen. But I think just that could be a really interesting point to just figure out, is that true? How do you see that? How do you think about that?
To settle that kind of question, you'd have to go through several steps. You'd have to decide on what you mean by learning in a sense, and how you're going to measure it, and then you need to carry out. You find some data somehow, maybe carry out some experiments or whatever, and then in some sense measure this thing, like how much implicit versus explicit learning is going on. Yeah, that's what you have to do. I mean, maybe some people have done that before. I don't know. I haven't seen any research of that kind. So I don't know. I mean, it might be that people learn more implicitly than explicitly. One thing that I do know about quite a lot is learning approaches or teaching approaches that are based on the idea of discovery, which is partly to do with implicit learning. Basically, trying to, there's a kind of a constellation of ideas around it, but things like trying to engage learners, often children, in thinking by setting them problems and making them think about problems rather than trying to give them solutions, I suppose. That's just one of 100 ways to say this. Or like an example of this is what's that guy's name again? I can't remember. There's a kind of turtle programming language. It's like you use it to move this robot turtle around. It's been around since the 70s or the 80s. It's called like Logos or something. I can't remember. And the guy who invented this programming language is intended for children to learn programming, and with the idea that they'll mess around with this turtle, and like mess around is a word that I'm using intentionally, because the idea was that they were going to sort of play around basically with this turtle, with programming this turtle, and then on that basis they would kind of learn how programming works, because they would have done some playing around, messing around, and they would have discovered things just through their play. And I could go on, but there are many such many similar types of attempts have been made, like this turtle that I mentioned. I think he has a book called Mindstorms, where he explains his sort of theory. There's discovery learning, problem-based learning. Problem-based learning is big in medical schools in the UK. I think it's still big, actually. It was for a long time. And these various types of things which try to be less explicit in teaching, try to be more relying on the reasoning of the students or learners, so they can try and tackle the problem themselves. And basically, it's a long story, but basically a lot of research has been done on this, and it's all been found that explicit learning is better, like basically every time. Implicit learning has been a failure for decades.
What would you call explicit learning in this case?
So I mean actually explicit teaching rather than learning. Sorry, not learning. I should make that distinction. So by explicit teaching, I mean things like first demonstrating how to solve a problem, by giving worked examples, then giving sort of semi-finished worked examples to be where they can just finish parts of those worked examples. So it's like heavily scaffolded. Then remove more and more of the scaffolding until you get to until you get to no scaffolding, basically, but you're still solving very standard problems. And then do increasingly unusual looking problems from there. That's like a heavily scaffolded, heavily explicit approach. You say exactly how to do something, and then you basically get someone to practice gradually through several steps. And if you compare people who are taught in that kind of way over, I mean, this isn't done in I'm not talking about every single subject ever invented, but in various things where it's testable whether people are learning or not. If you can compare that against people who go through kind of discovery approaches, then in every conceivable dimension that you can measure, people who have this kind of direct instruction, there's actually a thing called direct instruction, capital D, capital I, which uses this. People who have this direct instruction perform better in every single way you can imagine. So like they are more, so they know the material better, they can solve standard problems better, they can solve non-standard problems better, they're more creative with their problem solving, they're more able to use analogies to solve new problems using their existing knowledge. They usually feel better about their learning, they feel more like happy and confident about it. It's just like every single side. And that's teaching, not learning, though. I mean, I do have to be explicit about that.
Exactly, and I would, like, number one, I really appreciate hearing this, and it just sounds like, in a way, this is really built for building a strong foundation, so that people understand whatever they're supposed to learn right now. Like you're helping them build a clear and strong foundation for that by going through these steps and making it slowly more and more complex, all of that. And at the same time, like for me, the distinction between explicit and implicit learning would be, explicit learning would be, I explain to you how to do all of this. And once you understand it, I'm like, okay, done. We're done here. Great. Whereas the implicit learning would actually be a lot of the problem solving itself, because you're learning how to recognize patterns. You're learning how to be like, if this thing is there, I need to use this tool. And if that thing is there, I need to use that tool. And a lot of that is, yes, it's explained to you, but if I look through this adaptive unconscious conscious lens, a lot of learning how to recognize, for instance, if we look at a math problem, to realize that if there is a certain symbol, I have to use a certain formula. That has a lot to do with implicit learning of connecting those two, so that I'm actually learning that, okay, those belong together, and that happens through problem solving. That doesn't happen through abstract understanding, that learning. And it seems like
it's concrete.
Yeah, it seems like what you called scaffolding, like giving people semi-solved problems where it's like, this is the problem, we're looking at this part of it, is basically teaching those patterns in a much more concrete way, so that it's actually easier for the unconscious to recognize those patterns and to integrate them.
Yeah, so two things here. One thing I want to talk about is literacy. One thing I want to talk about is something else. Let's talk about literacy first. So, so yeah, when kids learn to read,
the second one.
Second thing,
Yeah.
I can explain it in a single one. So, when kids learn to read, I spent a bit of time working at essentially a literacy company. Like, I made products to help kids learn to read, basically. So I had to know some stuff about this. So like when kids learn to read, then reading English is in particular was what I was looking at. Firstly, because English has the most research done on it. Mostly, I think, because English is spoken in the United States and they do a lot of research there. And the funny thing about English is that it's not written phonetically. So it's like a bit of a pain. Unlike, the majority of the world's languages, they have some sort of phonetic system for writing. But English has this bizarre spelling system, which is, although consistent most of the time, not all the time, is highly, highly complicated. So so kids have to spend a long time learning how to read and then how to spell as well. It's like the other side of kind of the other way around. But so learning how to read, you have to go through this stage where you learn, all the different ways that letters can come together to make sounds. And so, first of all, you learn the alphabet, and then you learn, okay, so some of these are easy, like the letter D is pretty much is always a D sound. There's not that many exceptions to that, really. But then, some things are complicated. Like, as soon as you get to vowels, there's all kinds of sounds that they could be making, right?
Especially in English, like there are so many different vowel sounds.
Yeah, I'm specifically referring to English in particular, because other languages you won't be able to so easily generalize for in this description. But anyway, when you're learning English, like, a vowel, an A can sound like an A, or like an R, or like an A, or like a whatever, right? So loads of things. So you need to find out like what sounds it can make and in what context it makes those sounds, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole long process. So there is an approach to teaching based on sounds first. It's called phonics. The one way or another, everyone who learns, all children at least who learn to read and write literacy in English will have some phonics. Some will have a more dedicated phonics-based program. Some will have relatively cursory phonics. It depends a bit on their educational philosophy. I'm not going to get into that too deep. But the point is that they do that, right? They learn the spelling bit. They learn the reading based on the sounds bit, and they can sound out words. You get to that level where almost every word they can sound out, right? Except for some really weird ones like yacht, Y-A-C-H-T. Like, what's going on there, right? Obviously, when they see it, they're going to say yacht.
Well, in German,
right?
You would say yacht, which is actually...
Exactly. Yeah. But in English, you don't say that. You say yacht. So, so they see it and they're like, well, it's a yacht or whatever, right? So they're still going to make that kind of mistake, obviously, because they don't know about the word yacht, but they can, most words, even if they've never seen it before, they can sound it out. Now, what happens, typically, I mean, obviously it depends, but typically, at least in the United States, it's around age 8 when children can learn this, right? It's age 8. But what happens at that age is that basically they can read lots of text, but they're really, really, really slow. And then the next stage of development, well, it's kind of, literacy is an incredibly complex process, but you can basically talk about 2 aspects of it, or 3. So one of those aspects is at that age, at age 8, you have this division between the classes of American society, because up to age 8, doesn't matter what, how rich you are, what color your skin is or whatever, pretty much most kids are kind of reading more or less the same. Like, the difference is really not very big. But then past that age, suddenly you get a massive difference between classes or races or something, right? I mean, those 2 things are sometimes not too different in America. But so, you have, I'm not trying to make a political point, right?
No,
basically, it's just like,
no, I was just thinking of a comedic act by I'm going to send that video to you, but basically it's about him being a really poor white dude and having a lot of black friends who are like, the white people, and he's like, damn, you think if I took all your money I would move right next door? Like that's his whole point, that white people can be poor too, even though it's mostly black people in the neighborhood he's in.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's just call it poor and rich. So generally the poorer kids tend to, so the poorer and richer kids are both getting better at reading actually after the age 8, but the poorer kids are getting better at reading slowly, and the rich kids are getting better at reading quickly. And the reason is because of a gap in knowledge. That's a real, the biggest difference is, well, there's another difference, which is a gap in the amount of actual reading volume. That's also related to knowledge, but so there's a knowledge gap essentially. Like the rich kids tend to just know more. It means that when they read a text, it can make more sense to them because they know the stuff, right? So that's one side. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but that is one side. Another side that I actually wanted to talk about is suppose that you have two kids and it's not a knowledge difference between them. What happens is that as you're sounding out every word, you have to look at every word and actually sort of consciously process it and go like, well, there's this letter and then this letter and then this letter, and you put all the letters together and it makes a sound. B-A-T sounds like bat. Right, so that word says bat, and then you move on to the next word, right? And it's kind of a slow process. But you've reached that level where you can do it, but it's a slow process. What happens is that as you do more and more reading, actually the individual words, like bat, gradually end up being memorized by like a separate system, like a separate cognitive kind of element. There's this gradual memorization where it just sees the word B-A-T, bat, and it just goes like bat, like that. You don't even actually see the B-A-T. You just see bat, right? And this is something behind, like when, for example, I don't know if you've ever seen these texts, but you have these texts where every word beyond a certain length, like every word, for example, that has more than 4 letters, has
it's completely messed up.
Yeah. So all the letters inside are jumbled, or like they have or something, something's wrong with them, or like they have a missing letter or something, and if you read that text, you can read it just fine. And what's happening is that separate cognitive system that's not involved in actually spelling out words is just sort of recognizing that, oh, it's got the beginning and the end, and the middle letters are kind of right to be this word. And it's just like, bam. And it's kind of almost like an image recognition. And the way that it happens is you just read loads of text, and gradually this thing gets like built up on the side, separate from this system that does the direct kind of decoding, which is requires much more effort. There's this thing that's being built up on the side of essentially just like memory for the shapes of words, and it can just intervene. And like one thing that has been, there's a lot of evidence for this model, partly from unfortunately, from people who've had strokes, because people who have strokes in different parts of their brain can have different parts of their reading sort of equipment, if you like, affected. So someone can be affected in their reading because if you give them the jumbled letters, they can't read it. So they actually have to spell out every word. And then if they come across a word like yacht, then they go like yacht, right? So that person has like the sort of memory part has kind of gone, whereas another person can actually read yacht. But if you give them a nonsense word they've never seen before, like I don't know, blid. That's not a word, right? If you give them the word blid, they'll be like, I've got no idea what that says. Like, I don't know. I've got no idea what that sounds like.
Basically, they can lose either the memory, the kind of like word library, or they can lose the phonetic or phonic sounding out thing.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, the implicit learning that happens here is, as you do loads and loads of reading, you sort of build up this sort of memory word bank, which is really, really, really fast. But you actually need to have the explicit learning of the alphabet in order to be able to do the reading, which allows you to do the building up of that word bank. And people there's this reading kind of philosophy called whole language or whole word. It's complicated. This is very political. Like people, it really, political is the right word. I mean, because it's involved in politics and because like people sort of mudslinging at each other in this world of literacy, really, honestly. but roughly speaking, there's this thing called whole language, where they're looking at they're actually trying to teach kids the entire word. So they're trying to not teach BAT, you're trying to teach bat straight off. And what they discover is that the results are not very good. You actually can't do it that way. You can't take that shortcut. So actually, you do need to have all this like built up. You do need to go in that order. You do need to like learn the alphabet and then learn phonics and then do all the reading and then you'll build up the word bank. That's the only way it's going to realistically work.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a second thing I want to say, but I don't know if you have a response to that. Also, I might want to change position because currently there's a car arrived, so it's
let's change position in a few minutes, or shall we do a quick one right now?
Now would be good, to be honest.
Okay, let's have a short break then.
Okay.
Yes. So what I wanted to say about that is, I'm really curious in this also about the distinction of explicit and implicit learning, because I really get the explicit and implicit teaching and how important the explicit teaching is. And also even looking at the sounds, I am curious about how much of that is really explicit learning in the sense of, oh, I'm reflecting on this and I'm like, chick, 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 and how much of that is actually also happening in the unconscious of connecting these. Like, I think in this model of if we look at short-term memory, long-term memory, it would be really clear. It would be like, this is short-term memory. I repeat it often enough, it ends up in the long-term memory. But if I look at it more as, what are all of the systems that are involved even in learning that this shape, the S, sounds like S, and how to do that. And if I remember, my mother is a teacher, so when she teaches like words and letters, it's about, you don't just show an S, but you show a snake that makes the S. And so you already use kind of knowledge they have. So again there, like, what's the explicit learning and what's the implicit learning, and how important is the implicit learning in the process of learning that?
Yeah, so going back to the sort of two stages here, that you go through a kind of essentially a phonics stage followed by a wide reading stage, let's say. So going through that, we know for sure that the wide reading stage involves lots of implicit learning. As far as you know, picking up the shapes of those words goes, you don't have to
think about
like a lot. That's pretty much certainly like very close to 100% implicit. You know, you're just picking up that the shape of this word is like this. This is partly why it's a surprise as a research result, that you know, that people are doing this. People weren't aware that they're doing this. Nobody thought people were doing this, but actually they are. So it's clearly that's implicit. So that's kind of settled as far as that's being implicit. But then the other side is like, is it implicit or explicit? Just started raining. Is it implicit?
Well, good that you're inside now.
I'm inside, yeah. Is it implicit or explicit, or how much is it implicit or explicit when we're looking at the first stage, the phonics stage? So with the phonics stage, I mean, one thing that really one thing that might be important to that is that a really important aspect of learning to read at that stage is something called phonemic awareness. So before children actually encounter any writing of the alphabet, then they can have different levels of awareness of various, essentially linguistic ideas, or almost meta-linguistic ideas. So things like the idea that language is made of sounds, that the sounds are limited in number and consistent, or more or less consistent, and that and that you can split up words into individual sounds, and you can say the word bat is made up of b followed by a followed by t. Now, a lot of children don't know that, and you know, some children know that kind of, but they kind of don't. You know, like they vaguely know that. Some children are very, very clear about that, and then the level of clarity about that is very important in their subsequent learning to read. So I don't know whether I don't know how I would classify that, but certainly the actual,
but
it's been shown.
At least it implies that there is already lots of groundwork that can be there and cannot be there, like this,
And in fact,
and that's all implicit, basically.
yeah, and in fact, it's also been shown that by explicitly getting children to explicitly break down words into sounds and do other kinds of explicit exercises, you can improve their phonemic awareness, which then impacts how easy it is for them to learn to read. It makes it easier for them to learn to read in future. In like future meaning like 6 months down the line or a year down the line.
I mean, you're basically through those explicit tasks, teaching them patterns that they can then use. At least that would be the way I would look at it. If I have these explicit tasks and I learn, oh, this is this, this is that, I can break this up. Like actually, I'm able to really learn those patterns so that then my system can recognize them later on. Or would you disagree with that?
I wouldn't. I'm not sure I use the word pattern, because like you're kind of more learning. I suppose that at some level there's got to be some patterns, but it's more that the idea that you can analyze words down to these pieces, and then you're learning kind of to recognize these pieces. So you're learning to recognize the word, in the word stay, there's an S at the beginning. You're going to recognize that piece, and there's the word T that comes after it.
What I mean by patterns is, if I remember, I witnessed my younger siblings learning how to read, and they were at that phonic stage, and they would look at words and they would go, but it wasn't like, okay, so that's the S. So they learned what those things are, and that would just come automatically. What they were then struggling with figuring out is, what the fuck is that word? Like, oh, store. So they in one level they had memorized, this is S, this is T, this is O. So that's what I mean by patterns. Like those things get taken into long-term memory, basically.
The word pattern I would normally use for something which is more complex, because it sounds like this is more units rather than patterns that are being learned. Like a pattern, you could call the entire word a pattern. I think that kind of pattern recognition process is or pattern learning process or whatever, is what happens when you're in that second stage where you can already sound out words, but then you have to do lots of reading. You end up speeding up how quickly you can read, because you recognize entire shapes. Now this entire shapes thing, I think that's definitely a pattern recognition thing, called pattern recognition. But this thing, it's because it's the idea of the unit, the like individualness of the things you're learning. Pattern recognition, I normally think of like large, sort of kind of complicated things, which you would call a pattern. They need to have several elements at once, rather than like this is a single element.
Well, I don't think it's a single element, because it's a shape that's connected to a sound, that's connected to other things.
So I would call that association rather than pattern then. You're associating a sound with a shape.
Yeah, and I mean, right now we might just be in the level of what word would you use for it, what word would I use for it, because I think we're pointing to the same thing.
I definitely don't want to be like just like a pedant or anything, but it's just that I don't want to be like a philosopher who has to define every term really in lots of detail. It's just that when I use the word pattern recognition, it's actually quite, as far as I'm concerned, quite different in usage. Like, I mean, for example, throwing this in a completely different perspective, if I somehow was trying to create like a sort of a robot that could read or something, let's say, I don't know if that's sensible, but like suppose that I was trying to do that, then it's sort of, for things like recognizing the shapes of words on a page, I would definitely use pattern recognition kinds of algorithms, I suppose. Whereas for things like, this is S, it sounds like this. That's not something where, I would use a completely different technique. It wouldn't be that same thing.
I'm fine with calling it associations. The main thing I had as a thought that I would like to throw in is, number one, I would be curious, and I don't know if you know anything about that, if children with speech impediments have more difficulty learning this phonic stage. That's just a thought I have, because again, I witnessed a sibling going through basic speech impediment therapy, and how a lot of that was not actually about explicitly teaching this is how you correctly do it, but actually learning new ways to build tension in the mouth, learning new ways to move the tongue, and that through those exercises, the speech impediment solved itself, which then had long-term effects. And I would be, so again, I would go into this, that even in this being able to put a phonic sound to something, there is lots of learning that has gone into that can have happened and that could have not happened. And I don't know anything about language learning, so I'm curious if there would be a difference for somebody who might have a difficulty saying certain sounds.
Yeah, so I have to say I don't actually know anything really about speech impediments, unfortunately, but I do know a little bit about various kinds of problems with reading, problems with people learning to read. So basically, generally speaking, when someone has a problem to read, now like a lot of research has gone into literacy and reading, especially in English. So cognitive scientists and people know a lot about how this stuff works with quite a high confidence. And what happens is as long as you get someone who knows what they're doing, then you can actually diagnose a person's reading problem as a problem in some specific stage or specific element of this kind of several stage thing. So it might be that there's one kind of dyslexia. Dyslexia, I think, is kind of broader term for having trouble reading, kind of. I don't remember the exact definition, but like there's more than one thing that dyslexia is basically. One type is when you are having trouble getting the letter to sound correspondences right. So for example, you're having trouble with the shapes of the letters. We're having trouble with the idea that this letter can be connected with this sound. And then like basically if you can more or less solve that problem, usually that person can read fine afterwards, like as in they learn to read fine. So what happens is essentially that as far as I know, the best treatment for that is like really intensive practice of that specific thing. And eventually you even though you have whatever problem at first, eventually through enough practice you actually overcome that. You just might require more practice than usual. Or there might be at some other stage, basically. There might be some other thing where you have trouble. So that's as far as I know. As far as reading difficulties goes, it's like there's one thing in the many. One classic one is just not enough vocabulary. So if you just don't know enough words and you're reading a text that has lots of unknown words, and by lots of, it doesn't have to be very high. Like you only need you need to know over 95% of the words in the text in order to be able to understand it. Below that figure, and you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding it. That's a rough cutoff, but it's a pretty good cutoff. So like 5% is doesn't sound very high. If you don't know 1 in 20 words, then you're going to be like seriously having trouble reading a text. This applies to foreign language, also applies to your own. But yeah, that means if you're at that level, what's holding you back is your vocabulary. So in one way or another, you've got to address that issue if you're going to continue to learn to read or learn to read better.
Do you still have something to add to that?
That was all, yeah.
Wonderful, because can we try to kind of translate this to something like maths? Because what I'm thinking right now is when you were talking about how basically to teach, to do this explicit teaching, direct instruction, how you show how to solve a problem, you break the problem up into pieces, you have people do the different problems. Like, I can imagine that basically as fundamental literacy in mathematical problems in a way. It's like you show that this one thing equates to using this technique, and so basically in a way I imagine it's similar to that. Like it's not the same, of course, because there's, for instance, not that phonic phase, but there is in a way of learning. If there is this shape, there is an X with a small 2 on top of it, that means you do this. And if there is an X with a small 3, it's basically the same, but you add this to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one thing is that literacy is kind of better understood than maths, actually, in terms of how well we know about how people learn to read and how the reading process happens cognitively is actually extraordinary. It's like it's a solved problem, which is a crazy thing to say about anything about the mind. That we basically know the answers, right? That's like, whoa. Whereas maths is much more complicated than that in terms of knowing how people learn it and how people use it, and this sort of thing. So one thing about, there are a few things about maths that, while of course it would be lovely to use the analogy of literacy, there are a few places where that analogy falls down, which makes it more difficult to use literacy as an analogy. One of those is that, well, I suppose one of those is that, okay, if we were going to be very mechanistic about how we're going to teach and I suppose learn maths, right? Then there's actually, because of the way of people kind of wanting to save effort, then people can learn maths in a very algorithmic and non-reflective way, and there's kind of, in a way, there's like two ways of learning it, kind of, right? In a way, there's a kind of very algorithmic and non-reflective way where you kind of go like, when this happens, do this, do this, do this, do this. And then there's a much more reflective way, which is kind of thinking about the meaning of processes. Now, I don't think that it's, I don't think there are no places where the algorithmic way of thinking should be, I don't think there are no places where it should be used or that it should be avoided at all costs. But if the entirety of someone's mathematical knowledge and understanding is based on those kinds of procedures, then basically their understanding is very shallow, because they only know how to respond to like very specific stimuli. And this is a real issue because of the idea of transfer, right? So this is something we mentioned before that we'll talk about one day, and we haven't had time to, but or maybe we will in future. But with literacy, you're not really, the idea of transfer is not really so relevant, because suppose that you're reading English, then presumably the whole idea is that you are going to read in English in future. Like, you're actually going to be doing exactly this thing. And so the skills you're learning are exactly the skills you're going to be using. So there's not really any transfer necessary. Whereas, the maximum amount of transfer you need is like, you need to read from a book, but you also need to read from like a street sign and a computer screen, and that's kind of transfer because they're different, background colors. But it's like hardly, it's not something people have difficulty with. Whereas with maths, the hope is, at least, this can easily, I don't want to get into like policy or anything, but the hope is, among a lot of people at least, that people learn maths and then they can use it in some sort of situation outside of the original situation, right? Outside of, like, you've been presented with this neatly formulated like equation or something, right? Or completely abstract situation, and we want you to, find the right number, like that, right? That's not usually people's hope about people who are learning maths. Usually their hope is that this is going to be applied somehow. Now, in order for that to happen, you're asking for transfer, you're asking for quite a lot of transfer. And what we know about people learning maths and lots of things, is that transfer is really difficult to come by. It's actually very difficult to teach people in a way that results in transfer. I'm currently reading a book about it. I'm not that not all the way through, but anyone who's taken some time to look at the research on transfer needs to, I mean, I've never heard of anyone getting more optimistic by reading research, let's put it that way. Like, whenever you read the research, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe people do so little transfer, at least the stuff that happens in the classroom. So, so that really changes the nature of what you're talking about when we're talking about learning maths and learning literacy. Because learning literacy, you once you learn it, it's done, and it's like you just do the same thing again, just like, you know, read text, just like you've been reading text all the time. Whereas this is like, well, how are you going to, you know, use your mathematical understanding to like model the way that a virus is spreading around the world, you know, very topical now, or like, you know, to understand, you know, how you can, I don't know what you want to do, like most efficiently pack things or whatever you want to do, I don't know, but like, you know, you're going to have some situation, you can apply it to a situation. The situation is going to be different. You've got to use an analogy. There's essentially a kind of an analogical thing to do. So as a result, it can be quite tricky. I mean, if you break it down to some basic pieces, I think maybe you can do it. Like if you want to talk about how people learn arithmetic, then to some extent, yes. But even arithmetic requires some level of transfer, because the whole idea, maths is all about abstraction, and abstraction is essentially like huge levels of transfer. Well, at least good abstraction is about being like, because you've got this abstract concept, it essentially means that you've got like every concrete concept covered, like every concrete situation covered. So when you talk about the idea of 5, you can be talking about 5 of anything, right? 5 of concrete anything, 5 fingers, 5 pens, 5 desks, 5 whatever.
I have a question about that, because so number one, transfer, I think, can be a really interesting thing to talk about. At the same time, I'm now trying to go back to that explicit teaching, direct instruction. Mm-hmm. The way I would at least imagine it, and maybe my imagination of it is wrong, it would be that I am kind of teaching these chunks, and I am kind of telling people what to do with these chunks, hoping that they form a bigger picture in them, then in the end giving them more complex, abstract, weird tasks to do, in which I'm basically asking them to bit by bit transfer and abstract the knowledge they've learned through that. So tell me if I'm understanding something incorrectly.
Yeah, this is the direction I wanted to go in. This is the second thing that I couldn't put in words, because the first thing I said I wanted to talk about literacy, and there's a second thing.
Okay.
So which is this, right? So I wanted to talk about how you can take 2 dimensions here. Okay, you can take one dimension as the teaching, and one dimension as the learning. Okay, so we've got implicit. Let's call it implicit versus explicit teaching. So what that implicit teaching is probably going to be something like problem-based type of thing. You give people problems and hope that they learn the right thing. Versus explicit, you tell them exactly what to do, lots of working examples, kind of thing, right? So that's implicit versus explicit teaching, let's say. And then you've got implicit versus explicit learning. So I would really think of this, the way I would consider this is, imagine 2 people, one person who is capable, who has like particularly good at picking lots of things up implicitly, versus someone who's really bad at that. So they require explicit instruction in order to change anything they do, in order to learn anything. So if you can imagine making this sort of four-pointed grid, then you can kind of think about what's going to happen in each situation. So if you have explicit teaching, let's say, here we go.
Let's see if this is working. Yeah,
there we go. So if you've got explicit teaching, then the person who can only learn explicitly is actually going to learn whatever is taught explicitly, presumably, because it is being taught that way. So I'd say
so the learning is basically learning that is required. So
yes. So, well, we can say that the person who's only good at learning, like, is not really capable of learning implicitly very well, that person is, when there's explicit teaching going on, they are going to learn whatever is taught explicitly. Mm-hmm. They're probably not going to learn anything else because they're not good at learning implicitly.
Are there people like that? Or
Well,
is this more of a thought experiment right now?
it's not so much I don't really want to categorize people. It's just I imagine there's a variation in the extent that people are going to learn explicitly versus implicitly. One way you can see this, I mean, I suppose on one level you could almost call this intelligence. I'm not sure if that's appropriate to call it that, but like someone who's really smart is going to pick things up without you telling them anything, right? Whereas someone who isn't very smart, even if something's really obvious, they don't realize. You have to actually tell them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not sure if intelligence is appropriate as a
I mean,
label
if we go by this definition of intelligence, is the ability, ease and speed with which you can create and manipulate abstractions, then I think the higher your intelligence, at least in this IQ sense, the easier it is for you to take something you've learned, to abstract it, to manipulate it, and thus turn it into something different.
Yeah, so that's not really what. Yeah, intelligence might not have been the best word then, but I mean, another example then would be some people learn foreign language and are very good at mimicking. They don't put very much effort in, but their accent is actually quite close to right, even though they're adults, like quite close to authentic to the language that they're learning. Whereas some people learn a foreign language and then their accent remains very strong, coming from whatever their native language is. So I would say that these two people are different in their level of implicit learning. They may have learned the language to similar levels of proficiency, but one person might sound really kind of right. They might sound very, for example, close to a native German or whatever, right? Whereas another person might sound obviously not, obviously from some other place.
Interestingly, that second category, Americans, very often are absolutely incapable of taking on any useful dialect. At least most Americans I've seen that have learned languages, German, for instance, have such a strong accent. Something that I've seen more rarely with other cultures. Like, so that's a very interesting observation I've just personally made.
Yeah, I don't know the reason, but I certainly also been my experience actually. It's true, but yeah. So there's a difference in implicit learning, I would say, there as an example, right? So then what would happen is that that person has learned all the things that they've explicitly, I suppose, been taught, you could say, but they haven't picked up an accent, which is not something they've explicitly been taught, right? Where and if you were to put them in this thought experiment, if you were to put such a person, if you were to put such a person in an implicit teaching environment, then they wouldn't learn very much because that's not the way that they're going to pick things up. They're going to pick things up through explicit ways. Whereas the other person who learns implicitly, in the implicit classroom, they're going to learn whatever they're supposed to because they can learn that way. In the explicit classroom, they're going to learn whatever's taught explicitly plus some other stuff that they're going to pick up implicitly, I imagine. That's the kind of, it is a thought experiment, but that's the kind of way I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, what you're describing right now sounds similar. Sounds similar to your distinction between expertise and the learning style based on prior knowledge and expertise.
That's what, yeah. Implicit and explicit stuff is also very strongly linked to expertise as well. That's true.
So basically, somebody who has an explicit requirement for learning in a field that's trying to teach implicitly is basically screwed.
Yeah, you could say that. in this thought experiment. Yeah.
So that's the very candid version of putting it.
That's the candid way.
And
yeah,
let's make sure that this is a thought experiment.
Yeah, but this would be consistent with, or at least, on a superficial level, it would be consistent with research showing the effectiveness of direct instruction in the face of things like discovery learning. right? Because if this very crude like model thought experiment, where if you're going to look at it from the sort of direct instruction versus discovery learning kind of perspective, then what you'd expect is that based on that, more people are learning, or learning is happening kind of with everyone in the explicit case, and it's only happening with some of the people in the implicit case.
I mean, I think that is a very, so I think this distinction between explicit learning, implicit learning, and explicit teaching, implicit teaching, is actually potentially a really, really important thing to pay attention to. That for implicit learning to happen, I don't need implicit teaching. But for explicit learning to happen, I need explicit teaching.
Yes.
And that actually, if we look through this lens of expertise, saying implicit learning requires certain knowledge, requires certain basic patterns, whatever, like basic pattern recognition, basic stuff to be in place, that would make a very strong case for the explicit teaching to be required, especially with people getting into a field. Like,
and that's actually, yeah. So I was going to say, like, that's been confirmed by, I think confirmed very strongly by cognitive science research, that depending on the level of the learner, they need different levels of explicitness, actually. So intermediate or advanced learners require less explicit teaching. If you're too explicit to them, what happens is that it ends up actually wasting their time because they already know a lot of what you're saying. Right. So like, whereas it's kind of, whereas with beginners, you need to really spell everything out, because otherwise they're not going to know what hell's going on. So another thing I wanted to mention actually is that one way I'm looking at this at the moment is that implicit learning is it's kind of like it's on all the time. Well, that's the way I'm viewing it. It's like you don't, whereas explicit learning is only going to happen sort of under specific conditions. If someone's, for example, being taught explicitly, that's a condition on which explicit learning would happen. Whereas implicit learning is kind of like this background thing that can just be on. You just be picking things up.
I'm constantly having this thought about tennis coming to me, which some of the stuff I've heard about tennis training is that actually one of the most efficient ways to teach people who have no idea of tennis how to play tennis is to just give them a racket, stand across from them, and just start by putting the ball back and forth. And just by doing that, within about 2 hours, you can have people playing a really basic game of tennis. Like, they're not going to win Wimbledon with that, but they just pick up the movement patterns basically without any verbal instruction. But then if you get to wanting to improve beyond a certain stage of expertise, you have to suddenly start looking at all of these minute details, which then comes down to explicitly teaching people how to throw the ball when they serve it. And you spend like hours of just looking at how do you throw the ball, so that you learn that pattern newly, and through that you then change people's whole serve just by teaching them how to throw the ball. So it's basically, you then focus on details that you can explicitly teach, but those details will, through implicit adjustment of the rest of the system, start to change whole patterns. So rather than focusing on, no, you have to move your arm like this, you focus on, grab the racket like this. No, adjust your grip again. No, you return to your old grip. And through focusing on the grip, you change people's whole swing. So you then focus on details that you can explicitly control, and the body will adjust to those details in an implicit way.
I mean, I feel like when you talk about things like physical, like movement, sport, then in a way, you could say that people have a lot of pre-existing, could call it knowledge, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but people have done a lot of moving already. Yeah, if they're an adult and they're picking up tennis.
Let's say hopefully.
Well, even if they're very sedentary, they still have to like stand up off their chair every day. To move to the fridge and open the fridge door. Have to press the buttons on their phone so their thumbs get some exercise, right? So, people have a lot of kind of history and background of moving. I wonder if that's got anything to do with the fact that so much of learning tennis is an implicit reaction to these small explicit changes. Whereas until somebody is certainly for a novice in most non-physical fields, that's not going to be the way that you're going to do it. I mean, maybe at the expert level, sometimes saying something explicitly is going to have a whole sort of implicit background to it, and it's going to change lots of things. And but that's something I could conceive of happening among experts, but it's not going to happen among novices. Whereas it seems to be the case that with tennis, actually among novices, it is also going to happen, as you're describing, or at least almost novices.
Yeah, so the really interesting thing that comes up when you say that is basically looking at cognitive, let's call them cognitive learning, like where you learn a certain mental skill, reading, maths, whatever, that's actually a different learning process potentially than many of the skills, or it requires a different structuring of the learning because there might be so much less of a body of patterns.
It's like a blank canvas.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really, I'd never thought about that one.
Tabula rasa.
Tabula
rasa.
Yeah, but in a way, and I mean, on one level, I think that's not true. Like even for maths and for reading, there's whether your parents read to you, whether you've kind of played with scales and understanding that if you put the same thing on both sides, that makes a difference. I imagine that has an impact, but there is much less of that when it comes to like learning how to add on paper and to subtract on paper. Like that's very much learning something that's very new compared to learning a new physical exercise, because that has so much more to build on.
Yeah, I mean, so you read recently this book Range, right? I recently listened to parts of it. Yeah, I recently listened to an interview with the author, just as I'm reading all this stuff about transfer, and it's such a strange conflict in my head because transfer seems to me to be this kind of nail in the coffin of the whole idea of education. It's really weird because, like, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that it's the end. Like, it's just like when you read the transfer literature, then it makes you think transfer happens a lot less than I thought it would, and it's so important. So what does that mean? What are the implications? How are we going to overcome this, or can we overcome this? But then when you look at Range, the entire idea behind the book Range is transfer, basically saying, well, I mean, one of several, but a very important idea in the book is Range. It's transfer, because the idea is you learn, for example, Roger Federer being the classic example here. You learn like 10 or 20 sports or something, or you learn 10 or 20 musical instruments, as the orphan's case in other part of the book, and then it ends up improving your performance in some one particular sport because you've got these transferable skills. But it seems like these transferable, the whole idea of transferable skills again is the transfer thing. Maybe, I mean, I don't know have answers to this. I'm just saying it's surprising, and it might have something to do with the whole thing about
is a
we're
lot
kind
of
of already.
is a lot
I
of
would
the
say we're
transfer you're reading about right now like academic transfer?
generally, yes.
So maybe actually that a lot of the academic learning is on some level dis, like different from for instance physical learning. I imagine there must be some broad overlap, but it could be that there's something that's really different. For instance, through this, how much of that is basically expanding upon our conscious mind rather than our unconscious mind. So tennis is a lot of reacting. It's about things that our unconscious does automatically, and we can kind of hone that. Whereas doing statistical analyses is so counter to how our unconscious processes the world. And we have to teach ourselves these new ways of looking at data and doing tests with the data. And so it's basically like taking something that our conscious mind can do, but really honing in on that and kind of course, then teaching aspects of that to our unconscious. But in a way, it's this expansion of the abilities of our conscious mind. And maybe that's much more difficult to transfer.
I mean, the thing that strikes me most strongly as a very simple hypothesis to this is just that, that it really is the whole blank slate thing, that, we're not we don't have any instinctual mathematics inside us, or very little anyway, and we really have to start from zero. Whereas when it comes to learning tennis, you do know how to move your feet and arms. I mean, maybe not the right way for tennis right now, but you've got a lot of experience of moving them. So while expert might not be the right word, you have this huge history, this huge background of moving your body. Again, even if you're sedentary, you will have moved every day, right, for your entire life. So you have this huge background of that. And it means that there's this enormous context. It's not a blank slate. And as a result, maybe that means that your subconscious can do more, or that you can do things more implicitly for that reason, because of this huge, this vast background that you're working from.
I mean, it can what it connects for me just quickly to is even this distinction of statistics experts are not better at guessing than your layperson, because they've kind of trained their conscious mind to do something, and probably the process of doing the mathematical analyses is by now also unconsciously rooted, very much so. But that doesn't mean that their in the moment assessment of a certain thing is going through that analysis, but it still uses kind of the instinctual patterns we have.
Yeah, exactly. And if they were going to change it, they would have to actually practice that itself.
Yeah, the only way to get to the statistical analysis is to do the statistical analysis. There is no instinctual way of doing it.
But what I'm saying is that their instincts are no different to a layperson. But I imagine their instinctual answers would change if they specifically trained changing their instinctual answers. Like if they took a statistics course, which is like guess the probability instead of like doing any calculations, just like you're going to do loads of guessing, then eventually maybe they gradually build up a better instinct for actual probability figures. But given that that's not the way that you learn statistics, you learn it through like essentially doing loads of maths, then that's not what they end up learning.
That would be a very interesting hypothesis to test. Is if there is like, that would really be interesting to see if you can teach people how to more accurately guess statistical things, like that you basically train their intuitive approach to that?
I'm sure that there are many examples of this. There just aren't any that come to mind. One thing is that there are various kinds of statistical kind of traps that you can fall into, which are based on kind of having the wrong kind of statistical distribution. It's kind of like if you structure a situation in a particular way, it's very difficult for your subconscious to get it right. So anything with a fat tail, anything that's black swan territory, is really hard to get your gut right on. There's one example. Oh yeah, certain kinds of. Oh no, you can probably get that. I mean, I was going to say regression to the mean is another one. It's counterintuitive at first. I think maybe you can done it. So regression. I don't know if you want to hear about what regression to the mean is, but yeah, regression to the mean is just like if sometimes if you have like if you have a really good day today, tomorrow's probably going to be worse.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is, on average, days are worse than today, for example, because today's a great day. So as a result, today, like tomorrow, the most likely outcome is you have an average day. And that's worse than today. So usually after good days, you have like less good days. And usually after bad days, you have more good days. And it doesn't mean the one's causing the other. It's just because they're returning to the mean, returning to the average. But a lot of people will spot these kinds of patterns and go, look what happened. Every time, every time off happens, then on happens afterwards. Or every time that, on happens, then off happens afterwards or something, But actually it's just returning to the middle.
Yeah. I get that. The question would be if you can truly train kind of the unconscious guessing for that, because one of the things I'm just thinking about, I'm thinking also about like thinking fast and slow, and the amount of impact of, for instance, what's the number on your questionnaire, that you will guess percentages differently if you have a higher number on your questionnaire as participant number compared to if you have a lower number on your questionnaire because of priming and accessibility.
So back to what we were discussing, question one.
Yeah.
So like basically, yeah, when you're primed, you're raising the accessibility of some other random thing, right? So you're raising the accessibility of like numbers that are bigger than 10,000, or something, right?
Or just big numbers.
Or just big numbers, yeah, whatever, right? Big numbers, right? Or small numbers, right? Or whatever. You're raising the accessibility of those, but you also, if you are well trained in whatever field it is, then you also have a high availability of all of you have large amounts of information relating to that field. Whereas if you're not well trained in that field, you don't have that availability. So it's like you're not going to be countered by that expertise. You might be countered by your prejudices about that field, which are going to do something.
So that would be another question of, even if I'm just trying to think this statistical guessing of how much knowledge about the content of what you're trying to get an intuitive feel about you would need. So I think this opens up a whole ball game of like really interesting questions, actually.
I mean, we can pursue those, or we can pursue question 3.
I mean, I think we're almost at.
We're out of time. I don't know.
No, we're almost at 1.5 hours. So maybe let's not open question 3 today.
Yeah.
But this, at least what's happening in me right now is these thoughts give me a real sense of appreciation for the craft of a lot of the sciences we have, and how in one way you have to really just stick to the method, because that's the best way we have figured out to control these things. Like when it comes to statistical risk analyses, to get back to that, you can't just listen to your gut, but you actually have to do the process that we have found to be most precise. And in a way, we have to kind of override aspects of our intuitive hit on things, and to then in the end be willing to look at those numbers going like, shit, this contradicts everything I would have guessed, but this is what came out of this analysis.
I mean, it's amazing that that humanity has come up with such a range of theories and so on, which are so counterintuitive that, you know, they go against people's nature. It's obviously a long story, but you know, especially in the early days, how are people? You know, there was very little to justify the existence of science or anything like it. So, you know, how were people getting away with coming up with things that were counterintuitive and saying that they were true? I don't know.
And then it opens up a whole different question of how to pursue science in that, because what I also find is that in many fields of science, people then become attached to the theories they agree with. So they stop looking at new information that might be counter to what they believe to be true. Like so then there also has to be a complete impartiality as to what the right or wrong data is. And we just have to, we kind of have to be willing to look at everything and question and just take it in.
Well, I mean, humility is one of the keys to the powers of any kind of learning, science included. Nothing more annoying than an arrogant scientist. Might be. Well, but maybe they're wrong.
But yeah, that this actually gives me a newfound appreciation for a lot of the, like, this perspective gives me a real appreciation for science, scientific process, and also the profound challenges for us humans with our makeup to try to do something like science.
It's unnatural, yeah. In one, you could say.
Yeah, I would say it's deeply unnatural, and I think that also bears real problems, because there are things that we could that are scientifically feasible or scientifically interesting that we should potentially not do for ethical or whatever other reasons. But again, that science should not make those distinctions. It should be like, this is possible. So then we have to find a different balance in that place. Very interesting. This is a dude who studied the humanities, looking at science differently for a moment.
Wow. I studied sciences, so when I look at humanities, it's not like you think.
Yeah, but I imagine, like, is a lot of your questioning, a lot of your education questioning actually about academic education and this sense of how to teach people these academic skills? Is that what you're mostly drawn to, or?
I think the questions I end up being drawn to get bigger and bigger, or you know, they end up being very fundamental. Ultimately, the answers to these, you know, these questions aren't the kinds of ones that you can really interrogate directly very well. Usually, the best way to make progress is to try and understand smaller things. You know, try and make progress in smaller things. So one of the things that I look into quite a lot is academic learning, because I am actually somewhat interested in it, largely interested in it, but not limited to that. I mean, basically, yes, I'm interested in academic learning, but not only how can it proceed better or something, but also what does it actually do to people is a big question of mine, right? What does actually change in the world? And that's a bigger question, which is hard to answer. So as part of trying to answer that question, I'll try and figure out, okay, so how does it work? And how do people make it better? And then hopefully with a better understanding of that, then I can combine with some other things, then I can try and answer questions like, what does it actually do when people go to school? When people go to school for 12 years, how is that different than not going to school for 12 years? At an individual level versus, and also at a societal level,
And actually,
which is a really hard question to answer.
And actually, if I look through that lens that we just opened as this, what we're having here is an ad hoc, horrible theory, but let's run with it. If we assume that a lot of the academic learning is actually a very specific kind of learning, where we kind of learn to follow these procedures that are kind of founded on things our conscious mind can get, and then we learn how to follow these procedures to get to certain knowledge and to certain understandings, then that's really removed from learning patterns and strategies that function for our unconscious mind, and that helps our unconscious mind deal with everyday life in a, let's call it, better way. So actually those two might have virtually no overlap.
That would help to explain why transfer is so rare. I mean, maybe we don't transfer because the fundamental, as you described, I can't actually put it in better words than you just did. Maybe people can't transfer because of that.
So actually,
I suppose.
So actually, that would be a pretty fundamental claim based on a shitty ad hoc theory. but
gotta start somewhere.
Yeah, but that claim, I think, would actually explain a lot of the problems with the education system and why it doesn't produce a lot of the results that people would hope, like personal growth, development of people. It would actually really emphasize the beauty and power of science, but it would fundamentally distinguish that from the development of healthy and integrated and well-functioning humans. It would actually say that for many of the human activities of day-to-day life, science is not directly important, or academics.
Yeah, I mean this is like thorny from many sides. I mean, when we say education is doing what people want it to do, one problem is that different people want different things, including sometimes individuals want, we can talk about different groups. So we talk about parents want one thing, businesses want another thing, government wants another thing. Different parties within a government might want different things. So, different parents might want different things. So people want different things, is one thing. The second question is like, what the extent of our expectations, what are we expecting of an education system? What do we think it can do? Is it realistic to expect it can do this?
Your audio has gone really low just right now.
You can't hear me very well?
I imagine if you pull out your microphone again, I can understand you better.
Let me try.
I can already understand you better again.
Does that sound better?
Try speaking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
My microphone here. So anyway, it's thorny. As soon as you start talking about schools performing or underperforming or something, that's the kind of level of analysis I'm not going to be ready for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think a lot of people weigh on it regardless of, a lot of people weigh on it because it's a political issue, so everyone wants to talk about it. But I don't think I'm going to be ready for it until I have lots and lots more understanding of things that are less contentious, certainly for political reasons. Because once things get political, it's just like another layer of complication.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, for me, this kind of like small theory we came to at the end, like, of course I have no idea if that's true. It would just be one perspective that actually makes sense of quite a lot of the data I see. And it would actually open up really interesting new questions. For instance, like, how do we, and I think then we get back to the third question we won't cover today, like, how do we kind of add helpful information to the adaptive unconscious? How do we teach the adaptive unconscious patterns and processes that are actually helpful for larger groups of people? What does that even mean? And and kind of sit that as a second question or a second field of thinking next to, and how do we teach academic learning and the academic skills to function in this realm of research, or using certain academic procedures to problem solve within business and whatever we might consider coming out of the academic learning.
Yeah, we'll have to schedule another time to talk about question 3.
Yeah. Oh, that was a very, I think, in a way, really dense conversation today.
Yeah. Well, I managed to whip out some literacy research, so that got me talking for a while.
but it's, you have these things like flying around in your brain, don't you? Like, you've read all of this shit and it's like,
well, you know, when you say flying around, I mean, in a sense, yes. Flying around makes it sound like I'm thinking about them all the time, but I'm not.
No.
They're there, and then, like, you know, at the right time, out they come, but I don't even know they're there. It's like having them deep inside a wardrobe or something. It's like, oh yeah, I've got one of those, and just let me go get it. So, like, there might be, quite possibly there are lots more things like that. I mean, what that shows is that I've, you know, reached a certain kind of expertise threshold where I've forgotten some of the things I know, which is nice to know that I've reached that threshold. But yeah, it means maybe there'll be more things I can pull out in the future as well.
I think the way you pull them out, like, number one, you're very structured with them. I really appreciate that. And it seems like
I was on time today. That was another thing. I didn't insult you with my terrible timing and organization once.
Where we are back to human skills.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really do think this kind of conversation format of not having stuff laid out too clearly, but then drawing in thoughts and research, and even though it's not perfect, and we probably both make mistakes all the time because we read this thing 2 years ago, so we mess shit up, but I think it actually shows the interconnectedness, and at least for me, opening this field for this thought of really distinguishing academic learning from different learning, and the question of how big that overlap actually is, because I implicitly had this idea of there must be quite some overlap, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, is there? Like, that's a really powerful yet uncomfortable thought for me.
I hadn't thought about that, and that is actually a good yeah, it's a good perspective. It is a very useful perspective. Certainly, it does a lot to, when it comes down to thinking about transfer, as I was saying, like, it makes a lot of sense that you're not going to transfer much if this is sort of, in a way, you know, not touching those aspects of yourself.
Yeah, if basically
sides, yeah.
If basically what you learn are these let's call them intellectual procedures, but these intellectual procedures that are not based in how our unconscious processes the world, then those procedures will have very, very little impact on 99% of our everyday life decisions and assessments.
I mean, one thing that, one way that we could, be more careful about this is considering that different academic subjects actually are going to have very different content and nature. So like two things we spoke about today is literacy and maths, and one thing I've tried to be clear about is the fact that those two things actually are really different in our expectations of them, in the way that we think about them, in the way that they're learned. So they're actually very different. And I was trying to think, what other academic subject can I reach for? I reached for history as an academic subject, and history is something where because you usually use the idea about procedures, but in history, most of the time you're not thinking about procedures. Most of the time you're thinking about events, so kind of learning facts about the past and like stories about the past, essentially. And that, that the reason that's unlikely to affect your everyday, probably because your everyday doesn't have very much to do with the Habsburg Empire, right? You just don't need to think about that, right? But if you have a conversation with people about things like something like current affairs or values, maybe that would impact. Maybe, especially if you're very interested in that knowledge or something, you could say, well, this is a bit like when Charles V did whatever. That would be a case of transfer, though. That would be like transferring, going like, oh well, I think Donald Trump is a bit like, I don't know, Julius Caesar, whatever, whoever you want to call him. But yeah, that would be a case where, although it's hardly making a deep impact on your daily day-to-day decisions, it is sort of entering your day-to-day life.
I would actually, and this can be a whole other discussion, I would probably argue that history can potentially be one of the most impactful subjects, not so much for the facts, but for the stories we make up out of those facts. Like just from a perspective of a German, if oftentimes what's taught in history is this story of we as Germans are in a way bad for having done what we have in the past, and I don't think it's taught like that anymore, but it was often taught as, and we should actually be ashamed of that still. That will deeply affect how I relate to, for instance, being German or my country and thus my politics. So I think those stories that we are taught, also if through American history I'm taught that America is always the savior of the world, then that will impact how I approach the next proposal for war, depending on we need to save that country. So I think those stories are really impactful. The thing I was mostly thinking about when I said procedures was stuff like statistical analyses, was stuff like potentially learning about biology, but maybe learning about biology in an abstract way rather than in a, if you put this stuff into your body, that stuff happens.
I mean, if you want to hear an interesting story about history education, I've got an episode called History of Citizen Building about history education in Lithuania. When I was in Lithuania, I discovered that the way they view history is very strange. Like Poland and Lithuania have an intertwined history. They were actually a single state, essentially. They were kind of a double state, kind of a single state for several hundred years, but this was for a long time. It was for like a good hang on, a good 400-ish years, right? So, and Lithuanian history, in the way they tell it, they basically skip over several hundred years as if they never happened. Very strange, and it's basically because they want. I mean, I understand their motivation for doing so, but they want to distance themselves from Poland, so they don't want to say They don't want to talk about the close relations with Poland in the past, so they just completely skip over several hundred years. They don't want to talk about it. But it's like, how do they talk about before that and after that and miss out the middle? It's so weird.
I mean, that's very interesting as well. Yeah. So let's just take a few notes for our next conversation, so we don't forget what we were talking about. I want to write down this academic knowledge / procedures versus everyday knowledge and everyday procedures, something like that. And where is the overlap? This actually, I could talk about this also from the personal growth perspective, as to many people learn theories about the mind and about change and all of that, but those theories don't impact what they do, because it's the wrong kind of, it doesn't actually impact their unconscious strategies and their unconscious processes. We had the question of how to add information to the unconscious. Anything else that was kind of a thing that we wanted to deepen into?
The loose end. Well, at one point in the future, we'll probably talk about transfer. I don't think we'll get to it very soon. But
you're still in that book.
I'm still in that book. Yeah.
Becoming more and more disheartened. No.
Well, I knew coming into it that it was kind of like this. Yeah. But like I need to get to know the literature better. I think that it might be one of these things where I kind of get the sense that it's one of these things where it sounds really bad, but when you think about it carefully, you realize it's not that bad. It's a bit like irrational behavior. You go, oh, people are so irrational. Look at all these experiments, and you go, but it's not that bad. You know, like you kind of you reflect on it, and then you try and make sense out of it, and eventually you realize that okay, so maybe things are a bit worse than you thought, but it's not like the end of the world, and you can fit it inside your existing way of seeing things.
Yeah. I mean, I think transfer could also be a really interesting thing to look at, this distinction between academic procedures and everyday procedures, because there is also quite substantial literature on transference. So the process of transferring experiences I've had with people in the past on people I am interacting with now based on certain characteristics, and that transference works incredibly well. So again, it would be potentially about which knowledge is easy to transfer to our detriment or our advantage, and which kind of knowledge is really difficult to transfer.
Yes, that is interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't have any obvious other like loose ends to add.
Yeah. And again, a third point to add to transfer would be this physical sports thing, that movement patterns are potentially quite transferable. But yeah, so I think we have questions and topics for another 20 conversations.
No, keep going.
Just in these.
Well, I mean, every time we speak, then we usually end up with at least another question. So.
Yeah, but I really enjoy these exchanges. Like it really helps me to connect all these things I've picked up on in all sorts of different directions and to connect them to really concrete questions. So
yeah, they're very. I like it very much as well. I like them very much as well. They've been very helpful to me. So, do you know any of the people who watch them?
I know that people are watching and liking. I haven't really gotten many comments yet, but I think it's one of those things. I mean, what we do here is a bit strange. We talk about topics that many people are kind of half interested in, but also not that much. But at the same time, I think if people are into these questions, they can really take something from them. Like,
yeah, no, I mean, so basically what we're saying is like your YouTube audience is like a general. It's just people from YouTube. It's not like 100 people who are watching it. No, okay. I thought maybe that you knew some people personally who are watching it.
No. The only comments I've gotten for it is basically saying thank you, but nothing more specific.
Oh, okay.
But then again,
I'm going to probably re-listen to some of these in the future.
Yeah, I mean, in the future, giving it a bit of distance.
Yeah, I'm obviously not like immediately, but
yeah.
But I mean, I re-listened to the episodes of my podcast occasionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that helps me.
I'm just going to quit the recording for today.
Yeah, that's fine. Plenty.